Today's podcast is supported by Winston Strong LLP. Winston Strong, a trusted legal advisor and advocate for clients across virtually every industry. Coercive Capital is proudly supported by Hummingbird. Hummingbird is a modern compliance platform designed to make financial crime investigations smarter, faster, and more effective. Because today's financial criminals are sophisticated, savvy, and agile, meaning the tools used to fight them should be too. Learn more at hummingbird.co. Welcome to Coercive Capital. I'm Elaine Dezensky. There is an opioid crisis in this country. No one can deny this. The Center on Disease Control estimates that in 2023, about 200 Americans died every day from opioid overdoses, more than 75,000 Americans per year. It is the leading cause of death for Americans between the ages of 18 and 45. These are staggering statistics, and this is a trend that all of us should do our part in helping to reverse. One of the ways we might want to think about combating this epidemic is to examine it through an economic and financial lens. According to former Attorney General Bill Barr, the opioid crisis, fueled mostly by fentanyl, cost the United States nearly $1.5 trillion in 2020. That's the equivalent of 7% of US gross domestic product. But there's another, perhaps worse aspect to this. Fentanyl, the leading synthetic opioid, is fueled by Chinese underground money laundering networks and Chinese manufacturers of precursor chemicals, together with the Mexican cartels responsible for making pills and distributing them. The US is facing a massive economic security challenge trying to address these illicit networks. An April 2024 report from the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party examined how the People's Republic of China directly subsidizes the exports of 97% of fentanyl precursors and deadly fentanyl analogs and other synthetic narcotics, chemicals that are illegal under its own laws. Former Attorney General Barr has also noted that without China's part, there would be no fentanyl crisis, and yet China has done little to stop the flow. There is no one better to examine the financing and security issues related to fentanyl and the opioid crisis than Ray Donovan, one of America's foremost experts on the matter and a leading voice in helping us understand and expose the vast money laundering networks that support the fentanyl trade. Ray is a 28-year veteran of the DEA, serving as its head of operations and as special agent in charge for the DEA's New York division, responsible for many of the highest level global narcotics, money laundering, and narco-terrorism cases. He also ran the interagency team that captured not once but twice and brought to justice the notorious leader of the Sinaloa cartel, Chapo Guzman. I recently spoke with Ray in an effort to better understand more about the financial and national security factors related to fentanyl and what might be done about them. Ray, welcome to the show. I'm so honored to have you with us on Coercive Capital on the Illicit Edge Network. Thank you for being here today to talk to us about the fentanyl challenge that we're facing.
Thank you for having me, Elaine. It's my pleasure.
Thank you so much. I want to jump right into the angle for our conversation, which is really digging into the money laundering networks that fuel this crisis. And it's something I and others have written about as a money laundering crisis fueling a drug crisis, and one that has taken the lives of about 250,000 Americans since 2018. It's incredible the impact that this epidemic, this crisis has had on the US and why it's a national and economic security challenge for us. But maybe to jump right into the money laundering analysis, we're not talking about the old regime of cartel controlled bags of cash showing up at the border, as we might have seen with the heroin epidemic. But how did we get to where we are now, which is a really sophisticated money laundering operation driven by the Chinese? When did you start to kind of see this change in terms of how illicit cash was moving through the system?
So let me give you a foundation very quickly of what that looks like. So historically, when you look at the illicit narcotics and cocaine, let's just take cocaine as an example. Primarily, the methodology of laundering or cleaning that money back to source countries like Colombia would be through bulk cash smuggling or black market peso exchange. Those were the two methodologies. With synthetics, which is methamphetamine or fentanyl, um, we started seeing other technologies, other methodologies deployed, specifically by the Chinese to move money a lot faster. And as those technologies advanced, like digital currencies, we started seeing digital currency ATMs popping up, Bitcoin ATMs popping up all over South America. We started seeing Chinese organized criminal groups not only using financial institutions or trade-based money laundering, but also using a whole host of different methods to move money a lot faster than historically how we would see that. That started around 2013, 2014 is when we started seeing precursor chemicals for fentanyl come into the United States, the southwest border, and then smuggled into Mexico, converted into fentanyl. And at the time, it was being added to heroin and then smuggled back north. That's when we started seeing Chinese organized crime start to really take a hold in regards to the fentanyl crisis. But prior to that, they were already involved with methamphetamine production throughout Mexico. 2016 was a key year for us, though. We see it as a convergent year because at the time you had Mexican cartels that were pressing fake fentanyl pills. We saw the dark web, social media. We saw the populations that historically used heroin and historically used diverted pharmaceuticals now to converge. So it just exploded. We started seeing a lot more smuggling of fentanyl directly into the United States around that time period.
Yeah, it's like a perfect illicit storm that you're talking about. Maybe we could dig a little bit more into this money laundering triangle that is fueled through these Chinese money laundering networks, their ability to operate globally, the convergence of that network with the needs of Mexican cartels, and of course, the growing demand for fentanyl in the US. Can you walk us through exactly how this triangular trade is happening?
Yeah. So the Chinese became experts in what we call mirrors, or in Mexico, espejos. And really what that's indicative of is the speed by which money is exchanged and transferred back to the cartel. And I'll give you an example. If a drug cartel smuggled their drugs across the border and it's distributed in an area, it's then picked up and aggregated. And then it would be passed off to a U.S. cartel or money broker's point of contact. As soon as that money is picked up and delivered to the Chinese side of that, the money would be released the pesos would be released in Mexico back to the cartel. It was immediate. There was no drag or waste in time. But it's really indicative of what black market peso exchange really is. So I think I have to explain that a little bit so that your audience understands what that looks like. So the cartel's number one goal is to make money. And more often than not, it's in US cash. And their goal is to get that money back to, whether it's in Colombia, whether it's in Mexico, get it back to their country. And so the fastest way to do that historically has been through black market peso exchange. And so what that means is you'll have a money broker in Mexico. That money broker would then go to a business person, let's say a Mexican business that is looking for US products and has a US exporter. And so they have to get US cash to that exporter to get those goods. And so what they will do is exchange pesos for dollars back to the drug cartel for fee. And why does it work for them? It works because they avoid taxes, they avoid tariffs in some cases, uh, bank fees. And so they're really safe, and also the exchange rate. So they're saving money by going through the black market and opposed to going from bank to bank, right? And so they're getting their hands on US goods. So often it would be a Mexican business or Colombian business that is going to the money broker. The money broker is really playing the middleman between the cartel and that business in that country. Where the Chinese got so sophisticated is that the Chinese were also the exporters and the importers. So you'll have Chinese businesses in Mexico that are the importers, and Chinese businesses in China that are the manufacturers and exporters. And so they were making money on both ends, and they still are. And there's many methodologies that they deploy. They could use the financial institutions that we see. Well, cash is still deployed as well, but trade-based money laundering is by far the biggest method and the fastest, and it's the most lucrative method for them to move money worldwide. And I'll give you an actual case example that I had while I was the special agent in charge in New York. We had a group that was moving phones. They would buy Apple phones, Android phones, and for example, they would spend $100,000 on the phone. Well, at the time, all those phones back in China, even though they were manufactured in China, were worth 300% of a markup on what they cost in the United States. So even when the Chinese criminal groups were losing money, they were still making money, and it was very fast. Now, phones were one thing, clothing, you name it, cars, expensive wine, all American goods that would be purchased with drug proceeds, put in a container and shipped to China, sold, recoup the investment, and make a profit on top of that. Well, then you would have these Chinese businesses that exist both in Mexico and China that would either wire the money or send goods, and the goods would be sold in Mexico. So when you talk about the triangle, you're looking at United States, China, and Mexico, and the movement of money and goods behind the drug trade.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the trade-based money laundering angle, because I think this is a particularly challenging part of this problem. How do you how do you think we should go after this trade-based money laundering risk? What is it that we need to be doing? Is it better manifest information? Is it more coordination, maybe with Mexico and Mexican ports? What do you think that looks like?
So trade-based money laundering is really challenging to go after. Obviously, it's a lot easier for us with the BSA to go after, criminal groups utilizing financial institutions. Um, but trade-based money laundering is just that. There's not there isn't too much regulations. I mean, yes, you may have to fill out a form if someone comes in and spends $10,000 in a specific store, but you can come in with 5,000, 3,000, and constantly buy, and you're basically washing money relatively quickly. That is a challenge because we don't want to slow down commerce, but at the same time, we want to be able to identify and go after these criminal networks. And I think there are some areas where we could focus in on that will really kind of pin down some of these groups that are at scale utilizing our economy to launder billions of dollars across the world. And that's one of those things that came up in the hearing that we had back in April of this year to talk about ways that we can go forward against these criminal elements that are utilizing our system to their advantage.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go back as well to the fentanyl money laundering triangle that you've laid out. One of the challenges is that the dollars don't leave the U.S., the pesos don't leave Mexico, the RMB don't leave China. There's a mirrored network. It's very sophisticated. It's working globally uh, to facilitate a lot of criminal activity, not just fentanyl. But it also presents a particular challenge for financial institutions. Um, First and foremost, I think because it's difficult to be able to pinpoint the particular money laundering risks as cash moves into the system, but also because increasingly these transactions, as I understand it, are happening outside of the traditional financial system. Could you help us understand the migration of that thread and why this is such a challenge for banks?
Oh, it does still happen throughout many banks. And so I'll give you an example of just what happened last week with the plea agreement of TD Bank to the tune of $3 billion. And so I've always said this about banking institutions is that it's better to have a strong offense than a defense. And so what I mean by that is your compliance. So if your compliance is constantly trying to defend itself from the government coming after you, then you got a problem. I think you have to these banks have to invest more money, more energy, more time into building up a robust compliance department that will get in front of the problem before it becomes a problem. I mean, we remember Wells Fargo. Now look at TD Bank. It's the biggest plea agreement in history. And that should really kind of shake all the financial institutions that Department of Justice, IRS, DEA was very focused on that. Now, to get to your question, where else do we see, as in regards to financial organizations, money laundering? Through money service providers as well. So, or money service businesses. And so we would see, for example, when I was the special agent in charge in New York, we had one particular MSB that was moving just under $1 billion a year back to China from many different criminal networks throughout New York City. And so that's just another way for them to send money back to China. And as you mentioned, the money, oftentimes, if I'm a Chinese businessman and I want to invest in America, they'll exchange yuan in China, and then the U.S. cash will get moved in the U.S., that same business, and they'll buy real estate or buy businesses in the United States or buy luxury goods in the United States and ship it back to China. But the money really just enters into the banking or the financial institutions. There's other methodologies that we're seeing more and more of, which is cryptocurrency is being utilized. As I mentioned, we're seeing ATMs pop up everywhere, especially in cartel-controlled cities, especially in known criminal areas throughout the world. And so that more and more has really brought different disparate groups of criminal organizations that historically never worked together. Now they're collaborating to move cryptocurrency throughout the world. And it's so fast. And it's a challenge for law enforcement because law enforcement, by and large, still works very much coming up into an organization and not necessarily coming down into an organization.
Yeah. Is there a pathway where you could see imposing sanctions of some kind on banks in China or Mexico that are failing to properly monitor transactions or otherwise facilitating these flows? Certainly, we can get to U.S. banks and hold them accountable, but what about this extraterritorial challenge and how we address that?
So it's a great question, and it's one of those things that we strongly believe that is a path forward for us, and I'll tell you why. The challenge for the fentanyl trade and opioids and methamphetamine has been that once we identify an organization or a chemical company, individuals, the executives, and we charge them, we indict them, they pivot and they just shut down one company, open up a new one. The area that doesn't change is those banking institutions. They still utilize the same banks, the same contacts, whether it's in China or Mexico, Panama, or the United States. And so that is a key choke point for law enforcement and the governments to really pursue these criminal organizations because that doesn't change, and they need them. They need them to help facilitate the movement of goods and money throughout the world. So it's something that we certainly are discussing of ways to really hold them accountable, and not just in China but also in Mexico.
Yeah, it would seem like a good shot across the bow going after a major bank in China or Mexico or both could send the right message. But I also think there's a challenge in terms of following these transactions and getting the level of transparency required to really figure out, which banks are complicit. And some of that I think is tied into beneficial ownership.
Right.
challenges, shell corporations, really the opacity that unfortunately defines some parts of our global financial system. How important do you think it is to kind of address this issue of beneficial ownership and shell corporations more generally in the fight against fentanyl?
It is very important, but it still remains to be one of the biggest challenges in trying to trace back illicit funds. So we would see cartels in Mexico that when they do have an affiliation to a certain industry, they are not putting their names upwards and frontwards or a company that they own as the owner of a certain business or industry. They'll utilize individuals that have nothing to do with the drug trade. So we'll see that everything from shell companies to Casa de Cambios that are owned by the cartels or import-export companies, but they're often, there's no registration to determine who is the real owner of these companies. And so going backwards into the banking institutions, that's a challenge as well. Who really owns the money or who is tracing the money backwards? The cartel utilizes unwitting or non-cartel members to also move money worldwide. And so we've seen that from time to time. I remember when we had the Chapo investigations, one of the key things that the government wanted us to do was trace back his money. And it was a challenge because we believed that his money was tied up in the land. And so he was buying real property with a lot of the money, and he was buying it, and then he would give half of it to farmers in the area, and half of it was for poppy cultivation at the time. So it still remains to be a challenge for us. And that's just Mexico. Going into China, it's even harder.
Yeah, yeah, and it's a bit frustrating, I have to say, that it's taken so long to get to a point where we're now addressing beneficial ownership. I mean, the regulations are taking some time, and there's been quite a bit of pushback around that. But when we think about how these opaque structures that are uh, inherent to our system, right, that are really within the fabric of our system, and how it's being weaponized against us, I can't imagine why we wouldn't want to solve for that. Um,
Right. It changes too, Elaine. So, for example, we see what about 50 billion a year in remittance from the U.S. to Mexico. So there, but these are small amounts, that aggregate into millions back into the criminal networks in Mexico, and we'll see billions of dollars leaving the U.S. going to China, still utilizing some of the traditional methods through the TD banking, for example, from last week. But by and large, Mexican cartels will still get their money in cash, especially meth money will still get smuggled down into Mexico in cash, or to a bank along the border and then pulled out of the bank. So the banking institutions are still used. They're going to continue to be used, and that's why I say that the best thing that a bank could do is really just have a strong compliance department that works with the government and is constantly on top of the regulations and staying engaged and active to hold back from these criminal. It's just a matter of when, if not, they're already doing it. These criminal elements are going to try to expose a weakness and to move money worldwide through their banks.
yeah. What about some of these other non-financial institutional players, and even the chat services like WeChat that are part of this money laundering challenge? What do you think we need to be doing in terms of regulation and oversight? I know you've looked into some of the threads on WeChat, and you might want to share some of that as well. I know it's an interesting story.
Well, it is. So it goes back into what I was talking about in 2016, where we saw this convergence, right? This convergence of how drugs were being marketed and how drugs were being distributed, but also the technology behind it. So we talked about how the dark web or the open web and social media was being utilized to now to help distribute drugs throughout the United States. But it also came down to communication applications. So WeChat or Signal or Telegram, also Venmo, Zelle, Cash App. made it so fast to do a transaction, to do a deal. In the case of WeChat, behind WeChat, it's end-to-end encrypted, so very little access to any data coming off of WeChat. And so you have Chinese organized criminal groups that could very easily move money, and they are moving money throughout the United States and throughout the world on that platform. But then again, it's not just WeChat; it's other applications. Telegram was another one in Mexico. Signal to this day is another one. WhatsApp, another one. So the communication applications really changed how criminal groups could communicate, move money, organize the movement of drugs in the United States, arranging money pickups, and then entering into the financial institutions. It made it so much more efficient and faster. And so the challenge for law enforcement is working with these companies and trying to get them to work with us, and then being able to target those criminal networks that are exposing their platforms. But it is a constant challenge, especially encryption.
Winston Strong is an international law firm that for more than 170 years has served as a trusted advisor and advocate for clients across virtually every industry. Winston & Strawn's law practice, made up of more than 950 attorneys across 15 global offices, is built on the talent, creativity, and determination of its lawyers and an unwavering commitment to its clients. Winston & Strawn boasts an exceptional financial crimes compliance practice comprised of attorneys who have decades of experience assisting clients with Bank Secrecy Act and anti-money laundering compliance counseling, state and federal enforcement matters, and related investigations. Learn more about the firm's capabilities at winston.com. Hummingbird is a compliance platform that's reimagining what's possible from financial crime investigations. Teams using Hummingbird work more efficiently and effectively without compromising on quality. Investigators quickly get to the heart of each case with information at their fingertips and compliance-grade automation and AI to boost productivity. Designed for essential work in anti-money laundering, anti-fraud, customer due diligence, and more, Hummingbird allows you to customize the platform to your policies, giving you exactly what you need to get the job done. Hummingbird is determined to fight financial crime by empowering those on the front lines, because financial crime never stops evolving, and neither should the tools you use to stop it. Learn more at hummingbird.co. That's hummingbird.co. Fentanyl is the deadliest drug threat our nation has ever faced, end quote. That's how Attorney General Merrick Garland began a press conference last year, announcing 8 indictments the Department of Justice brought against China-based chemical manufacturing companies. Companies responsible for producing the very chemical compounds that are used to make the drugs that flood this country and lead to the deaths of so many. Continuing my conversation with former DEA Head of Operations Ray Donovan, we dive into a closer examination of the flow and supply chains fueling the synthetic opioid epidemic. I'd like to switch our focus a bit now and talk about the precursor challenge. Precursor chemicals, also a challenge in terms of the Chinese origin of these chemicals that are used to make fentanyl. The pills, I think, are typically pressed in Mexico, but they rely on a steady stream of precursors that we really haven't been able to curb. And frankly, where we're not getting much help, if any, from the Chinese government. This is really a big part of the supply chain challenge. What do you think we could be doing around the precursor challenge? Do we need a North American strategy to deal with that?
Well, it's a great question. I think we need a whole of government strategy, right? And yes, a North American strategy, which would mean that Mexico is partnering up with us. I speak to 5 points in as far as fentanyl trafficking goes. The first is manufacturing. Actually looking at China and looking at the production of fentanyl derivatives, the precursor chemicals, and then the exportation of those chemicals to the Western Hemisphere, being turned into the fentanyl and then trafficked to the United States. So that production is the first area to really kind of go partner up with China. and pressure them to just stop. Because one of the big issues that came up in the hearing, Elaine, was the fact that China was incentivizing the exportation of fentanyl into the United States and Mexico and the precursor chemicals. And they were doing this by giving 13% tax rebates for their precursors and fentanyl to come into be produced and exported directly into the U.S. That's the first thing that has to change, right? Right off the bat, if they drop that, then you see a significant drop in regards to China. Then when you come into the Western Hemisphere, the next area or choke point is really the ports. Mazatlan, Manzanillo, Veracruz. The ports are key for chemicals coming into Mexico. There are some ports in Central America that are utilized as well, but the key ports in Mexico, just being able to do a better job of going after the chemicals as they come into being tested and seized in the ports would really start to slow the stem of production in Mexico. The issue that we've had in the past is that we have seized tons of these chemicals, and trying to get rid of them and dispose of them becomes a challenge. So this is where you talked about a North American plan. Well, we need to have a plan of how we would go after them, seize them, and dispose those chemicals, because they're nonstop and they're steadily flowing into Mexico. The next area would be clandestine laboratories in Mexico. So one of the areas that we were focused in on many years ago was really just going after the labs in Mexico along with our Mexican partners and shutting down those laboratories. There was a time where we were taking down over 100 labs. Now, it wasn't a year, and it wasn't just fentanyl or meth. It was heroin. It was all illicit drugs. But that trickled down to like single digits recently. Now, getting back to that would be a key. The next focus area would be the border and strengthening the border. Now, we know that the vast majority of drugs that come to the United States come in through the border. Stronger technology, more personnel, more focus there. Seizing more will definitely slow the stem of illicit drugs coming in and being distributed throughout the United States. And my final point is really social media platforms. Historically, if someone wanted to buy drugs, they knew an area in their town where they would go, or an individual who was the dealer. Now that has moved to social media platforms more and more. So, or delivery services where individuals could reach markets all over and deliver drugs to anyone, anywhere, and including sending it directly to your house. So distribution has really changed, and it really has a lot to do with social media platforms. So being able to work with them to slow that flow of illicit drugs would also be a game changer. Now, that's on the supply side. On the demand side, a lot more has to be done in education, prevention, treatment, because you can't just attack the problem from one side. I think you have to look at it from both ends.
Yeah. So, if we had the leverage to convince Mexico to do certain things, to convince China to alter its behavior, what are the one or two things that we should be asking these countries to do, and how would that have an impact on reducing these flows into our country?
So for Mexico, I would ask Mexico to focus in on the ports, collaborate closely with CBP, U.S. Customs and Border. Uh, a lot more resources there. You'd see an immediate impact, I think. And then the second to that would be to focus in on the clandestine laboratories in Mexico. That's one area. The other area would be to expedite extraditions to the United States. Because once that happened in Colombia, we saw a complete transformation of the drug trade in Colombia. Once the Colombian government started extraditing their cartel members to the U.S. In fact, I think it drove Colombian cartel members to push cocaine worldwide, and really, in some cases, avoid the United States because of the laws. In regards to China, I would focus in first to shut down the tax rebates as far as the tax administration goes, and the exportation of fentanyl derivatives to the Western Hemisphere. That would be an immediate change. And then really just collaborate more with the United States to focus in on those bad actors that continue to export and share that information and share that intelligence. You'd see an immediate impact. And I'll give you an example of what that looks like. When COVID hit in 2020, we saw that Wuhan was locked down. And so there was a direct impact to the precursor chemicals or chemicals just coming into Mexico. The price started going up everywhere because there was no exportations. So that impact could easily change overnight if the PRC decided to and really transform that. So those two areas, both in China and Mexico, I think you would see, and it wouldn't only impact the fentanyl trade. It would literally impact the drug trade. So meth, cocaine, you name it, it would be a game changer.
Do you think it's a bridge too far to compel or expect that China might cooperate with us on the illicit financial flows and going after Chinese banks that are complicit?
Well, I do think that it would be easier for the PRC to collaborate with us going after the precursor chemicals than going after the money flow and the financial institutions. There's hundreds of billions of dollars that in the black market money in China. That it's not only coming from the United States, but throughout the world. That is a tremendous challenge, I think, for the Chinese to tackle that. Now, they've tried because of capital flight and billions of dollars leaving China. They certainly want to keep the economy robust. But the challenge remains for us is about ultimately saving American lives. And that has to do with fentanyl hitting the streets of the United States and other drugs, quite frankly. And they have a direct role in shutting that down. The financial institution, I think, institutions, that will be another challenge, a much bigger and broader challenge, in my opinion.
Mhm. We think about these, going back to the Chinese money laundering networks and the reach and impact that they have. I mean, you can go to, I think, pretty much any country and find evidence of Chinese money laundering networks. What do we need to be thinking about in terms of future risks and threats beyond fentanyl? It seems to me that the ability of these mirror networks to facilitate many kinds of illicit financial flows, certainly other kinds of narcotics, but also funds
Right.
associated with other illicit activity.
Right. So that's a great question. So we're very much focused on fentanyl, but we see other opioids being produced and smuggled into the United States directly from China. In particular, the nitazines, protonitazines. We see xylazines. We see many other different narcotics that are still smuggled into the United States and produced in China. So the focus, yes, on fentanyl because it's the most lethal. To answer your question, where else do we see Chinese involvement? And I want to be very specific: Chinese organized crime, involvement in money laundering. Oftentimes, it's just behind commerce. So, in instances of Belt and Road in South America, Central America, you might see businesses that are really just money launderings that were propped up to launder money throughout the world. And in particular, in Mexico, we've seen that in the last 20 years, where we've seen Chinese organizations import exports, companies, Casa de Cambio, shell companies, mining companies, and behind it, they're money laundering organizations, moving money from China or directly from the United States for cartels in conjunction with cartels, and also doing licit business. So it's not only illicit, but it's also licit, legal business. So they'll do the combination of both in these countries, and they'll commingle the funds from both. And so we've seen that, and it continues to happen.
Yeah, this is a fascinating angle. A few years ago, I was working on some corruption research related to the Belt and Road Initiative and really digging into how the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, has used the BRI and strategic corruption to influence both economically and politically in these countries where they're operating. And we also looked at how the Chinese diaspora come along with these projects and oftentimes set up local communities and networks where they're selling Chinese goods in countries. We saw this in Africa, for example. Oftentimes, Chinese individuals coming into these countries without visas. So evading that process of normal immigration, but then also setting up these networks. And so this is a really interesting angle around the expansion of China's influence abroad. And I think we do need to make that connectivity across these different modes of investment and what comes along with that in terms of both the formal and informal networks that ultimately have a huge influence on these countries.
That's a great point. So there are challenges, certainly within law enforcement's ability to infiltrate these organizations, right? And so the Chinese, unlike other groups, are very sophisticated in compartmentalizing how they launder money. And so often at the lowest end of money laundering, they're unwitting individuals that have no idea that the money came from a drug cartel or is derived from drugs being distributed. Also, culturally, they don't see the movement of cash as illegal. And this is our experience in the United States. And so there's challenges in culture, there's challenge in the language, right? Challenging in the fact that it's international and it's in China, and we don't have the same cooperation that we would get, say, from Mexico. So there's many different challenges for law enforcement to really infiltrate and take down these international groups. Now, more and more, we see Chinese organized criminal groups that have taken over money laundering in the United States. Historically, it was Colombian organizations, and it was through black market peso exchange. Now, today, it is more and more Chinese. We'll see a Chinese organized criminal group that will dispatch individuals to cities all throughout the United States just to pick up drug proceeds and drive it back to New York City. And then in New York City, that money would buy goods, and then it would be shipped on to China. So that happens all the time now, nonstop. The challenge now for us as a government is focusing in on those criminal networks and holding them accountable, right? Because we're talking about billions and billions of dollars. Yes, we can very easily do that looking at the banks, TD Bank in particular, and other banks. But it's not so easy to look at an individual or a network in a community that is literally moving millions of dollars every day, and then say, okay, we're going to focus in on this one individual because that individual is just part of a larger group that is moving millions and millions of dollars. And what I'd like to see is our government hold them accountable as well, not just the financial institutions.
Yeah. So I know you started your career as a Border Patrol agent many years ago, and I want to pivot now to how fentanyl is coming across the border. So I've seen estimates that somewhere in the neighborhood of 80% of fentanyl coming into the U.S. is actually being carried by U.S. citizens. Now, one question that occurred to me is if most of the interdiction is happening at ports of entry, is that number skewed in some way because what we're interdicting is coming through certain modalities and certain groups of people versus what might be coming in elsewhere, whether that's through the aviation system or maybe illegally outside of legitimate ports of entry. So how do you see this issue? I suppose either way, we have a challenge because it's coming in. And really hard to detect. We really don't have the screening capacity to do that. So how do we start to think about this challenge of interdiction?
Right. So I think the challenge of interdiction at the border has been our number one issue for many, many years, really. So when you look at CBP's role at Border Patrol, they do the best job they could do, I think, with the limited resources that they have. Last year in 2023, CBP seized 27,000 pounds of fentanyl. DEA seized about 12,000. And so that means that the 12,000 that DEA seized was internal United States. And so clearly it still gets through. The issue for them is trying to balance commerce and trade, right? Legal trade between the United States and Mexico, and keep traffic flowing, and trying to pick off bad actors trying to smuggle drugs into the United States. I think technology, we can certainly, there's enhanced technology that would increase the odds of identifying and targeting. I think what needs to happen specific to the border is more of a whole of government approach, and not just DEA or CBP or Border Patrol or FBI, but a really collaborative focus on the border of sharing intelligence and sharing information to target the networks and the nodes that are right there at the border that are the smuggling units on behalf of the cartel. These are these subgroups that control the border and really are pushing the drugs across into the ports of entry. Targeting them will be a game changer, I think. But that it does take a focused approach to really dismantling and disrupting that node in the cartel.
Yeah. And it seems to me it's not only a whole of government challenge for the US, but also for the Mexican government. And we're now entering a new period with Claudia Sheinbaum becoming president. I think she was recently installed and certainly has a lot of challenges and also opportunities. I know you've
Right.
spoken previously about this challenge between addressing these national security risks like fentanyl and organized crime and those deep networks across our borders, juxtaposed with the incredible trade relationship that we have with Mexico and with Canada. It's a North American free trade environment that is really the strongest in the world. And we're coming up on the review of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, the USMCA, which is the successor to NAFTA. And I really think it's going to be interesting to see how some of these issues play out, including fentanyl. I could imagine that it could become an issue in that free trade discussion unless we make some progress before that, which of course is challenging, but maybe that's a reason to really get on this and see what we can do to strengthen that engagement with the Mexicans, particularly around the corruption challenge. And I know you've outlined that in other discussions and in your testimony, really getting into the corruption challenge in Mexico. What can we be doing to engage with Mexico at this stage? What should we be asking them for? And how do we think about this in terms of addressing these national security challenges, but also preserving a trade relationship that is pretty valuable?
Yeah, extremely valuable. I mean, there's no question about it. I mean, it's one of our, if not our biggest partner worldwide, is Mexico, and they are a partner. And it's just that I think that with the new administration coming in or here, it's an opportunity for a reset, but certainly between us and them to collaborate and focus in on those criminal groups that really impact both countries, because Mexico is also being targeted as well. I mean, it's not just the United States. The amount of violence and homicides that takes place each year in Mexico is directly attributed to cartel activity. So I think, and where does that, who's really behind the cartel is the question. And I've said this before, and I'll continue to say it, is that for many, many decades now, law enforcement has been focused just on the cartel and the criminal elements associated to those big organizations. But who's really behind that? Well, there is corruption, and it is at the local, at the state, and even at times at the national level. And I think that we as a country have to look at that and really focus in on it, because taking down the cartel, they're always replaceable. But when you have corrupt officials that are behind them and propping them up and supporting them, that's where we can certainly assist, Mexico to really get after that and uphold the rule of law, because we both need each other. There's no doubt about it. And they are strong partners. And we've had a history of success in Mexico collaborating with our counterparts in Mexico. So it's an interesting time. I, for one, think that it is a possibility for a reset and a change. I do believe that President Sheinbaum certainly respects the rule of law and wants to, pursue these criminal bad actors that have impacted our country.
Yeah, I actually think amidst all of these challenges, there's a huge opportunity to rethink the border. And we talk about the North American free trade environment as the leading trade bloc in the world. It's democratically driven. Mexico is now our number one trading partner, and yet we have a border that doesn't reflect the complexity of that relationship or the opportunity. Maybe this is the time to really push for that 21st century border. And maybe the fentanyl challenge gives us more opportunity to get that message moving in the right way and thinking about the infrastructure needed on both sides of the border, not only to address that issue, but to ensure that legitimate trade is facilitated the way that it needs
Right.
to be. This is something we faced after 9/11. I was at DHS during that time working on some of the early programs like CTPAD and the Container Security Initiative. And at that point, we were looking for the bomb in the box. And
Right.
some of the legacy threats, particularly around narcotics, I think took a bit of a backseat during that time as we thought about the technology needed to address the terrorist threat. But here we are now 20 years later with some of the same challenges at the border, but trying to interdict the smallest of pills that are coming in on U.S. persons. It's really quite a transformation. Not that we don't have a terrorist threat, we do, but now we have something that is having a massive impact when we think about all the lives lost in America.
Yeah, the border is absolutely integral to national security. I mean, there's no question about it. But that encompasses many different things. It's not only terrorism, but it's also drug trafficking. From a Mexican perspective, it's guns going south, and so it is mutually beneficial to have a strong border in that regard. And I think that again, this is the opportunity now to do that with the new administration. But I think going backwards and further upstream, there's other areas that we can collaborate and share information, intelligence to go after these bad actors that impact Mexico. For example, Chinese organized crime. It makes sense for the Mexican government to want to pursue them and hold them accountable just as much as it does for us. And so that's an area that can immediately change overnight, that we are both focused in on those networks that are working internationally in Mexico to bring precursor chemicals for production of fentanyl.
Yeah. What advice would you give financial institutions that are trying to get a handle on these challenges? What would be your kind of top one or two recommendations?
So my number one recommendation would be to invest in your compliance. I think more often than not, that's kind of like a secondary, it's a regulatory responsibility. But I think as history has proven, it has to be a priority for any banking institution. It has to be. You have to know your customers. You have to know if you're being exploited by criminal elements. You have to collaborate with law enforcement, with Treasury. And I think that the more you get in front of that problem, the better, the safer that you as a banking institution will be. And it goes back to my original statement. It's better to be on an offense than to be playing defense. I think that would be, and that makes the most sense. It's just a matter of when. If not, they are not utilizing your branches, your banks to move millions of dollars. And I think it's an opportunity to invest in compliance and to collaborate with the government.
Great. I thought we might end on a story. You must have so many of them across your incredible career. And also, I want to just take a moment to say thank you for your service to our country. You're an incredible public servant, and we're lucky that we had you fighting the fight, and now you're continuing to do that. I know you were involved in the capture of El Chapo both times. And I thought it might be fun to just end on that story and for you to talk a little bit about the capture, the escape, and then the recapture of this famous cartel figure.
So the capture of El Chapo, whenever I talk about El Chapo, what really stood out to me most was the fact that you had 14 different agencies willing to put their egos aside and to share intelligence those agencies for the sole purpose of going after El Chapo. And what most people don't know is that we weren't only going after El Chapo, we were also going after his partner El Mayo at the same time. And so when we first started the investigation, many people didn't think that we could do it because he was bigger than life. I mean, he was in Forbes for being worth $10 billion. He had this aura of being untouchable. And we put a team together, and for years, for about 2 years, all we did was just build the investigation to the point where we infiltrated his inner circle and eventually launched the operation. And we caught him. I mean, it took some time, and it was a challenge. It wasn't easy. But I think really what stood out for me the most was working with Mexico, working with the Mexican Marines, working with all the U.S. agencies. And there literally was no ego. Everyone said, okay, this is what I have. This is what I could bring to the table. And what we realized is everyone had a piece of the picture. And when you put that together, you had clarity. So we were able to infiltrate his inner circle, and that's what ultimately won the day and allowed for us to capture him. Now, that was in 2014, early 2014. He escaped in July of 2015. Walked out of a 1.2 mile long tunnel, or he was on a motorcycle, and it took about 10 months to build that tunnel. And he flew right up to the mountains of Sinaloa shortly thereafter. That was disheartening because we knew what it took to really go after him the first time, but we didn't quit. So we brought the team back, the same team, pretty much from the first go around, same number of organizations, and within about 6 weeks, we were back into him after his escape. So it took us 2 years to first go around. It took us about 6 weeks to get back into him because we already mapped out everyone around him. So we knew who was in his inner circle. And so we were already tracking him about 6 weeks later. We launched an operation to go get him. He evaded us for about 2 weeks. We were chasing him in the jungles in Durango, in Mexico. And eventually, the Mexican Marines had a brilliant idea, and they wanted to flush him out. They knew that, or we knew that he was up in a certain area of Sinaloa, up in the mountains. So the Mexican Marines, and it was really their brilliant idea, was we're just going to go to every ranch and put pressure on them. Eventually, they forced them out in the mountains down into the city of Los Mochis, and they captured them. And so that was... to me, that also kind of opened up the door for a methodology of how we can collaborate with Mexico and with our own agencies for any mission.
Ray Donovan is a patriot, a noble public servant, and leader. And he's absolutely right. In order to counter the opioid crisis in this country, we need the collaboration of our government agencies, the collaboration of other countries, and the collaboration of all of us. Not only do we need a whole of government approach to countering the fentanyl crisis, but we also need a whole of industry approach, including the financial institutions, messaging platforms, money transmitters, and alternate payment systems that are compromised every single day. I thank Ray for his public service and for joining me for this critical conversation. It's time to rise to the challenge and dismantle these criminal networks. I'm Elaine Dezensky, and this is Coercive Capital. on the Illicit Edge Network.